The day had started like any other for Pastor Henry Lawson, a man whose presence was as steady and reliable as the small church he served in the close-knit town of Willow Creek. This was a town where everyone knew each other's name and stories were passed from one person to the next, with the ease of a gentle breeze. The townsfolk saw Pastor Henry as the calm in any storm, a man who, despite his modest living, always found a way to help those around him. It was his calling, his purpose. Little did he know, on this particular Sunday, his purpose was about to be tested in a way he could never have foreseen. As the congregation gathered in the warm glow of the church, the pews filled with familiar faces. The people here shared everything from harvest celebrations to whispered prayers for those in need. They were family in all but blood. Henry looked out over the gathering, offering his usual words of comfort, compassion, and hope. And as he spoke, his eyes caught sight of a newcomer sitting quietly in the back row, a woman he didn't recognize, her face pale and her eyes full of sorrow. She sat clutching her purse tightly, occasionally glancing up with an expression that seemed more in search of sanctuary than salvation. The sermon ended, and the congregation slowly trickled out, exchanging small talk and laughter as they moved. Yet the woman remained, watching as the church emptied until it was just the two of them. Henry approached her with his usual gentle demeanor, introducing himself as the pastor and offering a warm smile. She returned his greeting, and in a voice barely above a whisper, introduced herself as Sarah, a local social worker. Her voice trembled as she explained she had come not for herself, but to share a story, a plea, really, that had been weighing heavily on her heart. As they sat in the quiet stillness of the empty church, Sarah shared her story. She told him about a recent case involving 7 young sisters, all under the age of 15, who had been left without a family after their mother had tragically passed away. Their father, overwhelmed by grief and unable to cope, had abandoned them. The siblings had been separated into foster homes, scattered across the region, their bonds with one another already beginning to fray. Sarah's voice broke as she spoke of the older sister, a girl barely 14, who had taken on the role of protector, sacrificing her own innocence to shield her younger siblings from the harsh reality that had suddenly enveloped them. The youngest, just a toddler, had barely any memory of her mother. Sarah confessed she had tried every avenue to find a family willing to adopt all 7 girls together, but it was a near impossible task. Most people she spoke to had good intentions, but they also had limits. A single family willing to take on so many children, especially children who came with such heavy baggage, was a rare find. As Sarah finished, her eyes pleaded with Henry, though she knew it was an unrealistic request. Even the pastor, a man of great compassion, was only one person. Surely he couldn't take on such a burden. Yet in that silent moment, Henry felt a stirring in his heart, a feeling he couldn't ignore. It was as if all the sermons he'd ever preached about faith, kindness, and the call to help others had suddenly coalesced into one undeniable truth. Here was a chance to live those words, not just speak them, to put everything he believed in to the ultimate test. Without quite understanding why, he found himself telling Sarah, "Let me meet them. Just meet them." Sarah's eyes widened with a glimmer of hope, though both of them understood the weight of what he was suggesting. They set a time for the next day, and as Sarah left, Henry felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement, as though he were standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump into the unknown. That night, sleep eluded him. His mind swirled with questions he couldn't answer. How could he possibly take care of 7 children? He lived alone in a modest house that barely fit his needs, let alone the needs of 7 young lives. He wasn't wealthy, and he knew that the town's resources were limited. And yet, he couldn't shake the thought of those girls, frightened and alone, facing an uncertain future. He prayed, not for guidance, but for strength, because deep down, he already knew what he had to do. The next day, he met Sarah outside the group home where the girls were staying temporarily. The building was drab and unwelcoming, with chain-link fences and bars on the windows, a place more suited to keeping people in than making them feel safe. Inside, Henry was introduced to each of the sisters, one by one. The eldest, Megan, eyed him warily, her face set in a look of defiance that only thinly veiled her fear. She was the one who had taken on the responsibility of protecting her sisters, her posture stiff, as if prepared to shield them from whatever came next. One by one, Henry observed their faces, each one reflecting a mixture of confusion, hope, and guarded distrust. As he met the youngest, little Emily, she reached out and clutched his hand, and in that instant, something inside him broke. He saw not 7 children he would be adopting, but 7 children he couldn't bear to leave behind. The decision came as naturally as breathing. Henry turned to Sarah, his voice steady, but filled with conviction. "I'll take them. All of them. We'll make this work, somehow." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and even Megan's hardened expression softened, as though she sensed the gravity of his words. Henry knew this was just the beginning, that the real challenges lay ahead. But at that moment, he felt a peace he hadn't expected. He felt as though he had been preparing for this moment his whole life, though he had never realized it. As he drove the girls back to his modest home, the reality of what he had just committed to began to sink in. The house would need changes. More beds, more space, more food. The church salary he lived on was meager, and he knew he would have to stretch every dollar, but he didn't mind. For the first time in his life, he felt as though he was truly living his faith, embodying the love he had preached about for years. The girls, meanwhile, sat quietly in the back, unsure of what the future held, but feeling, for the first time in a long while, a glimmer of hope. When they arrived at his small, tidy home, the girls looked around with a mix of curiosity and hesitation. To them, it wasn't much, nothing compared to the life they had lost. But Henry welcomed them in, showing them around, doing his best to reassure them that this was their home now, for however long they needed it to be. That night, as they settled into their new surroundings, he found himself praying once again, not for strength this time, but for gratitude, for the chance to make a difference, for the opportunity to give these girls a safe haven, even if only for a while. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would test every ounce of his resolve, and in 15 years, the memory of this day would bring him to tears in ways he could never have anticipated. The first few days with the girls passed in a blur of adjustments, both small and monumental. Henry's once quiet home now buzzed with a constant hum of voices, laughter, and the occasional argument. It was as if a whirlwind of life had entered his solitary existence, filling every corner of his house. The sisters, each unique in their personalities and quirks, seemed to create their own microcosm within his walls, and Henry found himself both exhausted and exhilarated, trying to keep up with their boundless energy and needs. Megan, the eldest, took on a leadership role almost immediately, guiding her sisters through their new routine with a quiet but intense determination. She was still wary of Henry, watching him with a guarded expression, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. But Henry could see the weight she carried and how much she had sacrificed to keep her sisters together. There were nights when he would find her awake long after the others had fallen asleep, sitting silently by the window, lost in her thoughts. Henry understood that earning her trust would take time. He wasn't there to replace their parents, but he hoped, one day, to be a steady presence in her life, someone she could count on. Sarah, the social worker, had arranged for temporary financial assistance, but it was clear that the road ahead would be challenging. Henry's income as a pastor was modest at best, barely covering the essentials. Each day brought new expenses, school supplies, clothes, extra groceries. The girls had specific needs, too, needs Henry hadn't anticipated. Emily, the youngest, had nightmares nearly every night, waking up with a terrified scream that pierced the silence of the house. Each time, Henry would rush to her side, holding her close until she calmed down, whispering gentle reassurances into her ear. Then there was Olivia, the second youngest, who struggled with severe allergies and asthma. Her medical bills were higher than Henry had anticipated, and the cost of her medication quickly became a financial burden. There were moments when he felt overwhelmed, the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. But in those moments, he would look at the girls, at the way they were beginning to smile and laugh again, and he knew he couldn't give up on them. One day, as he was sorting through bills and wondering how he would manage the upcoming expenses, a knock came at the door. He opened it to find Mrs. Fletcher, an elderly woman from his congregation who had always been supportive of his work. She held a basket of freshly baked bread and pies, smiling warmly as she handed them to him. "I thought you and the girls could use a little help," she said with a wink. Henry's heart swelled with gratitude as he accepted the basket, and he invited her in to meet the girls. Word had spread through the town about Henry's decision to adopt the 7 sisters, and while some people were supportive, others were less enthusiastic. A few members of the congregation murmured behind his back, questioning whether he had made a wise choice. They wondered if he was fit to care for so many children on his own, especially given his limited resources. There were whispers of concern that the church's finances might be affected, that Henry's attention would be divided, leaving less time for his pastoral duties. Henry tried to ignore the gossip, but it weighed on him nonetheless. He had always prided himself on being there for his congregation, and he worried that his new responsibilities might interfere with his work. Yet every time he considered stepping back, the faces of the girls reminded him of why he had made this choice. He had given them his word, and he intended to keep it, no matter the cost. One evening, as Henry was helping the girls with their homework, Megan suddenly asked, "Why are you doing all this for us?" Her voice was sharp, tinged with skepticism. She looked at him with piercing eyes, as if trying to see through him, to uncover his true motives. Henry paused, taken aback by the question. He set down the textbook he had been holding and looked at her, choosing his words carefully. "Because I believe you deserve a family, a home where you feel safe," he said quietly. "I may not have all the answers or resources, but I can offer you love and stability. That's something every child deserves." Megan looked away, her expression unreadable. Henry could see the struggle within her, the desire to believe him, but the fear of being let down again. He didn't press her for a response, letting her process his words in her own time. He knew trust couldn't be forced, and he was willing to wait for however long it took. As the days turned into weeks, a subtle shift began to occur. The girls started to open up, sharing stories about their mother, small memories that brought both laughter and tears. They spoke of the little traditions they had shared, like baking cookies on Sundays or watching the sunrise together in the early morning hours. Henry listened intently, absorbing every detail, hoping to preserve these fragments of their past and honor the family they had lost. One morning, Henry was awakened by the sound of coughing from Olivia's room. He rushed to her side, finding her struggling to breathe, her small frame racked with wheezes. Panic surged through him as he realized her inhaler was empty, and he hadn't yet refilled the prescription. In a frenzy, he grabbed his coat, carrying her to the car, and drove as fast as he could to the nearest hospital. They spent the better part of the day in the emergency room, with Olivia receiving treatment for her asthma attack. Henry sat by her side, holding her hand, feeling a mixture of guilt and helplessness. He blamed himself for not being better prepared, for not anticipating her needs. When they finally returned home that evening, he was exhausted, physically and emotionally. The next day, as he was picking up groceries, he ran into Mr. Thompson, a wealthy businessman and member of the congregation. Mr. Thompson had always been a critical presence, known for his sharp words and lack of tolerance for what he perceived as irresponsibility. He approached Henry with a disapproving look, folding his arms as he spoke. "I hear you've taken in those girls," he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "I hope you know what you're getting into. Children like that come with complications. You might be in over your head, Pastor." Henry felt a surge of anger, but held it in check. He knew people like Mr. Thompson would never understand his choice, would never see beyond the surface. But he also knew that his decision wasn't for the approval of others. It was for the girls. He simply nodded, replying with quiet conviction, "I may be in over my head, but they need someone who's willing to try, complications and all." As he walked away, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would face the challenges head-on, no matter how difficult. For the first time, he felt as if he was truly living the principles he had spent years preaching. That night, the girls gathered around the dinner table, their laughter filling the room as they recounted stories from school and shared bits of their day. Henry watched them, a sense of peace settling over him. This was his family now, his purpose, and though the journey had only just begun, he knew he would do everything in his power to give these girls the life they deserved. As the weeks turned into months, Henry began to feel the weight of his decision more profoundly. Each day presented new challenges, from managing the girls' individual needs to navigating the complicated social dynamics of the town. He'd expected some struggles, but nothing could have prepared him for the intricate balancing act his life had become. His time was divided between his duties as a pastor and his responsibilities as a father, leaving little room for rest or even a moment to catch his breath. The girls had started school, and with that came a slew of other issues. They were new and different, and in a town like Willow Creek, where everyone knew each other's histories, they stood out. Some children were curious, others unkind. The girls came home each day with stories, some funny, some sad, of their encounters. Megan, as usual, bore the brunt of it, often stepping in to shield her younger sisters from unkind comments or bullying. Henry watched her, seeing the toll it took, and his heart ached for her. No child her age should have to shoulder such burdens. One evening, while helping Emily with her homework, Henry noticed Megan sitting at the kitchen table, her brow furrowed as she sorted through a pile of papers. She had a maturity beyond her years, and it pained him to see her taking on so many responsibilities. "Megan, what's all that?" he asked, nodding toward the stack of bills and notes she was looking at. "It's nothing," she replied, but her voice gave her away. She was worried, and Henry could see it plainly. She finally relented, saying, "I just wanted to help, to make sure you didn't have to do everything yourself." Henry reached over, gently taking her hand. "Megan, you don't have to take on all this," he said softly. "That's my job. You're just a kid, and I want you to feel safe enough to be one." Megan looked at him, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. But then she closed herself off again, the familiar guarded expression returning. "I know," she said, shrugging, as if trying to convince herself as much as him. The next Sunday, Henry arrived at the church to find an unusual sight. Several members of the congregation stood clustered near the entrance, whispering to one another. As he approached, the murmuring stopped, and a group parted to reveal Mrs. Cooper, one of the town's most outspoken women, known for her strong opinions on everything and everyone. She looked at Henry with a critical eye, her lips pursed. "Pastor Henry," she began, "we've all heard about what you've done, taking in those children. And while it's admirable, some of us are concerned." She hesitated, her gaze shifting to the others for support before continuing. "Concerned about the influence this situation might have on our community." Henry felt a pang of frustration. He had expected some resistance, but he hadn't realized how deeply ingrained certain biases were in his community. "Mrs. Cooper, these children needed a home, and I couldn't stand by and do nothing," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. She looked at him, unimpressed. "But what about the church, Pastor? You're spreading yourself thin, and some of us are starting to wonder if you can handle both responsibilities." Henry took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "The girls are now my family, and I believe that family and community are not separate things. They're intertwined. I won't neglect my duties to the church, but I won't turn my back on those children either. I don't see it as a choice between one or the other. I see it as my duty to both." Mrs. Cooper opened her mouth to respond, but another voice interrupted, a voice that Henry hadn't expected to hear. It was Mr. Thompson, the very man who had questioned Henry's decision to take in the girls in the first place. He stepped forward, addressing the group. "Now, hold on a minute," he said, his tone surprisingly conciliatory. "I'll admit, I had my doubts about Pastor Henry's decision. But I've watched those girls, and I've seen the way he's taking care of them. They're good kids, and he's doing the right thing, even if it's hard. Isn't that what faith is supposed to be about?" The crowd fell silent, stunned by Mr. Thompson's words. Mrs. Cooper pursed her lips but said nothing more, and the group eventually dispersed, each person mulling over what had been said. Henry caught Mr. Thompson's eye and nodded gratefully. It seemed that, despite the resistance, he was making some progress in shifting perspectives. But the challenges didn't end there. As the days passed, Henry faced another unexpected test. Olivia's medical condition was worsening, and her treatment required specialist care in a city several hours away. The cost was astronomical, far beyond what Henry could afford. He tried to keep his worries to himself, but Megan noticed his troubled expression one evening and pressed him for answers. "Is something wrong with Olivia?" she asked, her voice a mix of fear and determination. Henry hesitated, unsure how much to tell her, but he knew Megan well enough to understand that she wouldn't be easily placated. "Her treatment is expensive, Megan. I'm doing my best to make it work, but it's difficult." Megan was silent for a moment before she spoke, her voice steady. "I'll get a job," she said, as if it were the simplest solution in the world. "I can help." Henry felt a surge of both pride and sadness. He admired her willingness to help, but he didn't want her to sacrifice her childhood to shoulder adult responsibilities. "No, Megan. You don't need to worry about that. You just focus on school." But Megan was relentless, and within a week, she'd secured a job at a local diner, working part-time after school and on weekends. Henry tried to convince her to quit, but she refused, saying that she wanted to contribute. It was both a help and a heartache for Henry, watching her step into an adult role before her time. Meanwhile, Henry found himself reaching out to the community in ways he hadn't before. He organized fundraisers and spoke openly about Olivia's condition, hoping to rally support. To his surprise, people began to respond. Even those who had initially been skeptical of his decision to adopt the girls started showing up, donating what they could, offering words of encouragement, and even helping with the girls when Henry needed an extra hand. Slowly but surely, the town seemed to shift. People who had once questioned his choices began to see the love and dedication he poured into his family. They saw the girls growing, thriving, despite the challenges they faced. And as the community began to come together, so did the family. One afternoon, Henry came home to find Megan sitting on the porch, looking out over the horizon with a thoughtful expression. She turned as he approached, her face softening. "Thank you," she said quietly, her words barely audible. Henry sat beside her, surprised. "For what?" he asked. "For not giving up on us." "For giving us a chance," she replied. Her voice held a vulnerability he hadn't heard before. Henry placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Megan, you and your sisters have given me just as much as I've given you. I may have brought you into my home, but you've brought me something I didn't even know I was missing." In that moment, a sense of peace washed over him. He realized that despite the struggles, the financial strain, and the lingering doubts, he had made the right decision. The journey was far from over, but he no longer felt like he was carrying the weight alone. He had his family, his community, and his faith to guide him. And as he looked out over the town, he couldn't help but feel that something larger was at play. That maybe, just maybe, his choice to adopt the girls had been part of a greater plan all along. As the first year passed, the small home Henry had once known as a sanctuary for quiet reflection had become a place bursting with energy, laughter, and love. Each day was a new adventure, filled with the chaos and joy of raising 7 daughters, each with their own dreams, struggles, and quirks. Henry often found himself marveling at how deeply he had come to love these girls, how naturally they fit into his life, filling spaces he hadn't even realized were empty. But as much as they had found a home in him, Henry knew that life was fragile and could shift unexpectedly, a reality he would soon be reminded of. One cold winter morning, the family was jolted awake by the blare of an ambulance siren. It was Olivia again, her asthma acting up in the early hours, her small body racked with wheezing gasps that filled Henry with dread. The other girls huddled around, fearful yet trying to be brave for their sister. Henry scooped Olivia into his arms and carried her to the ambulance, his heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt since the day he first decided to take them all in. As the ambulance raced to the hospital, Henry gripped Olivia's tiny hand, whispering reassuring words that even he wasn't sure he believed. At the hospital, the doctors managed to stabilize her, but they warned Henry that her condition was worsening. Olivia would need specialized, ongoing care and possibly even surgery down the line. The news hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd been scraping by to cover the girl's basic needs, but these new medical costs were overwhelming. The reality of his financial situation felt like an insurmountable weight pressing down on him, threatening to break his resolve. As he sat beside Olivia's hospital bed, watching her sleep, Henry began to question everything. Had he taken on more than he could handle? Had he jeopardized the lives of these children he loved so deeply by thinking he could give them a better future? He was just one man with limited means, struggling to make ends meet while trying to keep a family of 8 afloat. The enormity of his responsibilities settled on him like a heavy fog, clouding his once clear sense of purpose. When he returned home later that evening, exhausted and filled with self-doubt, he found Megan waiting for him on the front steps. She could read his face immediately, sensing the worry etched into his features. Without a word, she wrapped her arms around him, holding him in a rare display of vulnerability. "You don't have to carry this alone," she whispered, her voice filled with a strength he didn't know she possessed. "We're a family. We'll figure it out together." Over the following days, Megan's words stuck with Henry, echoing in his mind as he searched for solutions. The situation was dire, but he refused to give up. He began reaching out, not only to his congregation, but to the entire town, explaining Olivia's condition and asking for any help they could provide. He organized a community meeting, his humility on full display as he laid bare the struggles he and the girls were facing. He expected skepticism, maybe even criticism, but instead, he was met with an overwhelming response of compassion. People he'd never met showed up, offering to help in any way they could. Mrs. Fletcher organized a bake sale. Mr. Thompson, who had once doubted Henry's decision to adopt the girls, donated a significant sum, and local businesses chipped in with goods and services to support the family. The sense of unity was almost tangible, like a web of kindness enveloping Henry and the girls, reinforcing that they were not alone. But amid this newfound support, a pivotal moment arrived, an opportunity that was both a blessing and a curse. Henry received a call from a large charitable organization in the neighboring city. They had heard about his story, the adopted daughters, the struggles with Olivia's health, and they wanted to feature his family in a fundraising campaign. They'd promised financial aid that could potentially cover Olivia's medical expenses and provide enough funds to support the family for the foreseeable future. The offer was generous and could change everything for Henry and the girls. But there was a catch. The organization wanted to craft their own version of the story, something with a more polished, media-friendly angle. They planned to downplay certain aspects, add embellishments, and present the family as a picture-perfect vision of resilience, stripping away some of the messier, more human parts of their journey. Henry hesitated, feeling torn. He desperately needed the support they were offering, but he also valued the authenticity of his family's story, the raw and real struggle they had endured together. He worried about how the girls would feel, being presented as symbols rather than as individuals with their own voices. He gathered the girls that evening, explaining the situation in simple terms, letting them know what was at stake. He wanted them to feel involved in the decision, to understand that their voices mattered. Megan, as always, took the lead, voicing her concern that their story might be turned into something unrecognizable, something that didn't reflect their reality. But at the same time, she saw the financial relief it could bring, especially for Olivia's sake. The family spent the evening talking it over, each girl weighing in with her thoughts and fears. In the end, they decided together that they would accept the offer, but only under certain conditions. They wanted to make sure their story remained true to who they were, a family united by love and struggle, not a sanitized version for public consumption. Henry called the organization, laying out their terms, and to his surprise, they agreed. The campaign launched a few weeks later, and it quickly gained attention, drawing support from people across the country. Donations poured in, enough to cover Olivia's medical costs and provide a small fund for the girl's education. The relief was palpable, lifting a burden that had weighed on Henry's heart for months. The girls seemed happier, more carefree, finally able to focus on school and friendships rather than the constant worries that had plagued them. But the fallout of the campaign wasn't entirely as they'd expected. While many people reached out with kindness and support, there were others who saw them differently now, as though they were public figures rather than private individuals. Strangers occasionally approached them in town, asking intrusive questions or making comments that felt too personal. The girls, especially Megan, struggled with this new level of exposure, feeling as though their lives were no longer entirely their own. Henry, too, found himself grappling with the consequences. While he was grateful for the support, he missed the simplicity of their lives before they became a story for others to consume. He felt a renewed sense of responsibility, not only to protect his daughters, but to honor the version of their story that they had worked so hard to keep intact. One day, as he walked through the town square with Olivia by his side, he noticed a group of people gathering near a bulletin board. Curious, he approached, only to find that someone had pinned a photo of his family from the campaign, accompanied by a note that read, "A reminder of what community and love can achieve." Beneath the note were signatures from dozens of people in the town, each expressing their appreciation and support for Henry's decision to adopt the girls. As he read through the messages, Henry felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He realized that, despite the difficulties, they had become a symbol, not just of resilience, but of the power of community and the strength that comes from opening one's heart. The town had changed, growing in compassion and understanding, and so had he. That evening, he gathered the girls and showed them the photo and messages, watching as their faces softened with emotion. They had been through so much, and yet here they were, a family stronger than ever. Megan wrapped her arms around her sisters, a rare, unguarded smile on her face. Henry felt a tear slip down his cheek as he looked at them, grateful beyond words for the journey that had brought them together. As they sat together, the family took a quiet moment to reflect, knowing that their story was far from over. They were not defined by the hardships they had faced, but by the love and resilience that had carried them through. And in that moment, Henry knew with certainty that he would never regret his decision, no matter the challenges that lay ahead. They were a family, forged through struggle and bound by love, and that was more than enough. With Olivia's health more stable and financial support alleviating some of their burdens, the family found a new rhythm, one that allowed them to focus on their dreams and daily joys rather than merely surviving. But just as they started to settle into this hopeful period, an unexpected event once again tested their resilience. It was a brisk autumn evening, the sky painted with shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. The girls were at home, working on homework or helping with dinner, while Henry attended a town council meeting. The council had called the meeting to discuss a proposal for a new development project that would bring jobs and economic growth to the area. However, the project required cutting down a grove of old trees near the town's edge, trees that were woven into the fabric of Willow Creek's history. The town was divided. Some saw the project as a long overdue opportunity for growth, a way to bring prosperity and attract new residents. Others felt it would destroy the very heart of the community, the natural beauty and heritage that made Willow Creek special. Henry found himself torn as he listened to the arguments, seeing the merit on both sides but wondering if there was a way to find a middle ground. And then, the meeting took an unexpected turn. A representative from the development company stood up and announced that they would be donating a substantial amount to the town, provided that they received unanimous council support. The donation could go toward schools, healthcare, and community programs, all issues close to Henry's heart. The representative then mentioned that they had heard about Henry's family and the recent struggles he had faced, and in a final pitch to win the council's vote, they offered an additional donation specifically for his family, a fund that would cover any future medical needs for Olivia and provide enough to ensure that all the girls could attend college. The room fell silent as everyone turned to Henry, waiting for his response. His mind raced, the enormity of the offer overwhelming him. This was a chance to give his daughters a secure future, to guarantee that they would have opportunities he had only dreamed of providing. But accepting the offer meant supporting a project that would forever alter the landscape of the town he loved, a town that had rallied behind him and his family when they needed it most. He felt the weight of the decision settle heavily on his shoulders. He wanted to believe that his choice could be justified by the potential benefits, but he also knew that some of the townspeople, people who had shown him kindness and support, would feel betrayed if he accepted. As the council members and townspeople looked on, Henry stood, clearing his throat, feeling the pressure of their gazes. "I appreciate the generous offer," he began, his voice steady but pained. "But I also believe that our town's beauty and history are not something we can simply replace with money or development. Willow Creek is more than just a place. It's a community, a legacy that has been passed down through generations. I cannot support a project that would take that away." A murmur ran through the room as Henry spoke, a mixture of admiration and disappointment in the air. The representative from the development company nodded, a tight smile on his face, before taking his seat. Henry knew he had likely forfeited the financial security that would have ensured a smooth path for his daughters, and the weight of that sacrifice lingered in his mind as he left the meeting. When he returned home that night, Megan was waiting up for him, a concerned expression on her face. She knew about the meeting and the decision he had made, and she could see the toll it had taken on him. "You did what you thought was right, Dad," she said, using the word Dad for the first time, a word she had resisted for so long. The sound of it made Henry's heart swell, and for a moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Over the next few days, Henry braced himself for backlash, expecting some in the town to criticize him for his choice. Yet, to his surprise, the community rallied around him, appreciating the stand he had taken to preserve Willow Creek's heritage. People he had never spoken to stopped him in the street to thank him for defending the town's natural beauty, and some even organized a grassroots effort to find alternative ways to support the local economy without compromising the environment. The girls, too, became involved in the campaign to protect the grove of trees. They joined local activists, creating posters, spreading awareness, and gathering signatures for a petition. Megan took a leadership role, rallying her classmates to support the cause. Henry watched with pride as his daughters found their voices, standing up for something they believed in, and in doing so, becoming part of the town's future in a way he hadn't anticipated. But the battle was far from over. The development company filed for an appeal, pushing forward with their plans despite the town's resistance. The issue became a hot topic in local newspapers, and tensions rose as the town split into factions, those who supported the project for the economic opportunities it promised, and those who wanted to protect the natural landscape. The girls became targets of both admiration and criticism, as their involvement in the campaign became public. Some parents complained to the school, saying that Henry's family was pushing an agenda that was not representative of the whole community. One afternoon, as the girls were walking home, they encountered a group of classmates who taunted them, calling them tree huggers and accusing them of holding the town back. Megan, as always, stood her ground, defending her family's stance, but it was clear the encounter shook her. When she arrived home that day, her usual strong front had cracked, and she burst into tears, admitting to Henry that she didn't know if she was strong enough to keep fighting. Henry knelt beside her, wiping away her tears. "Megan, standing up for what you believe in is never easy, especially when others don't understand. But remember, this isn't just about the trees or the town. It's about staying true to who you are and protecting the things that make our community special." His words seemed to comfort her, and from that day on, Megan continued to lead the campaign with renewed resolve. The other girls, too, found ways to support the cause, each contributing in their own way, whether it was writing letters, making art to raise awareness, or simply sharing their story with friends and neighbors. Then, unexpectedly, a miracle happened. A philanthropist who had heard about their efforts and admired the family's determination offered a generous donation to the town. This donation was contingent on preserving the grove, but it was enough to fund various community projects and revitalize the local economy without sacrificing the town's natural beauty. The development company withdrew their plans, realizing they no longer had community support. The town erupted in celebration, grateful for a solution that honored both progress and preservation. Henry and his daughters were hailed as local heroes, symbols of resilience and community spirit. At the victory celebration in the town square, Henry stood with his family, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and supporters. The girls smiled, their faces glowing with pride, and Henry felt a profound sense of fulfillment. As the evening wore on, Megan turned to Henry, her voice filled with wonder. "Did you ever think, when you first brought us home, that we'd end up here?" Henry shook his head, smiling. "I didn't know where this journey would take us, Megan, but I knew that together we could face anything." He looked around at his daughters, each one a testament to strength and love, and then out at the crowd that had come together, united by a cause greater than themselves. That night, as the family returned home, Henry felt the weight of all they had overcome: Olivia's health scare, the financial struggles, the doubts and sacrifices, and he felt an immense gratitude for every single challenge, for each had brought them closer together and strengthened their bond. The girls had not only become his family but also his reason for fighting, his purpose, his legacy. The community had been forever changed, united by a shared vision of preserving their heritage and supporting one another. And Henry knew that he and his daughters were now woven into the fabric of Willow Creek's story, a living testament to the power of resilience, love, and the courage to stand up for what's right. As he looked at each of them, he felt that they, too, understood that their journey was far from over, but that together, they were ready for whatever lay ahead. 15 years had passed since the day Henry Lawson first opened his modest home and heart to the 7 young girls who needed him. Those years had been a mosaic of struggle and triumph, heartbreak and joy, with each daughter adding her own unique color to the tapestry of their lives. The family had grown in ways Henry could have never imagined, each of the girls finding her own path, yet forever bound by the love and strength they had drawn from each other. The house, once echoing with the lively sounds of young children, had quieted as each daughter found her wings, stepping into the world with the courage and resilience they had learned within those walls. Henry, now in his late 60s, had watched with pride as each of his daughters graduated, went to college, and began their lives. Megan had become an environmental lawyer, dedicated to preserving the natural beauty of communities much like Willow Creek, inspired by the battle to protect the grove in their hometown. Olivia, despite the health battles she had faced in her childhood, had gone on to medical school, driven by a desire to help children with conditions like hers. Each daughter, in her own way, had taken the lessons they learned from their shared experiences and woven them into a purpose, something that gave meaning to the hardships they had endured together. Life had quieted down for Henry, though he remained a beloved figure in Willow Creek. His congregation was smaller now, many of the original families having moved on, but his faith was as steadfast as ever. He continued to preach, to support his community, and to offer solace to those who needed it, though now he often found himself reminiscing about the past, his mind filled with memories of the girls' laughter, their fights, their late-night talks. He knew his life's greatest purpose had been fulfilled in raising them, and he cherished the knowledge that they were each carrying forward a piece of him, wherever they went. One late autumn evening, as the air turned crisp and the leaves began to carpet the streets in shades of red and gold, Henry received a call from Megan. She had been working on a major environmental case, one that had taken her across the country and demanded nearly every hour of her time. Yet there was a warmth in her voice that hinted at something beyond her usual determination. "Dad," she said, using the word with that familiar mix of respect and affection, "I know it's short notice, but could you be at the church tomorrow evening? There's something we want to show you." Henry, intrigued, agreed without hesitation. His curiosity lingered all through the night and well into the following day. When he arrived at the church the next evening, he was greeted not by the usual quiet of the sanctuary, but by the warm, familiar voices of his daughters. One by one, they emerged from the shadows, each carrying something in her hands, a small, cherished memory of their time together. Megan held a scrapbook filled with photos and letters, moments frozen in time. Olivia carried a stethoscope, a symbol of her journey into medicine, one that he had inspired. As they stood before him, Henry's heart swelled with emotions he could hardly name. He had raised them, yes, but they had grown into women of remarkable strength and kindness, carrying forward the legacy he had unknowingly created. And then, as if on cue, Megan began to speak, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "Dad," she said, looking at him with eyes that held a depth of gratitude he could feel in his very bones. "We wanted to bring you here, to this place where it all began, to thank you. Not just for taking us in, but for showing us how to live with purpose, how to love without fear, and how to stand up for what's right." One by one, each daughter shared her own tribute to Henry, recounting stories of their childhood, of the quiet sacrifices he had made, of the unwavering faith he had instilled in them. They spoke of moments that had shaped them, memories that he hadn't even realized were so deeply embedded in their hearts, times when he had comforted them through loss, encouraged them to chase their dreams, or taught them to find hope even in the darkest of times. Tears filled his eyes as he listened, overcome by the realization that each small act of love, every choice he had made, had left a profound impact on them. And then, as the last of his daughters finished speaking, Megan stepped forward again, holding a letter. "We wanted to give you something," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Something to show you that your love, your guidance. It's a legacy, one that we'll carry with us forever." She handed him the letter, and as he opened it, he found himself looking at a deed to a plot of land on the edge of town, right where the old grove of trees stood. The land had been preserved, protected from development, and the deed was in his name, a permanent testament to the battle they had fought together so many years ago. The girls had pooled their resources, determined to honor his commitment to both family and community, and they had purchased the land, ensuring it would remain untouched, a sanctuary for generations to come. Henry was speechless, the weight of their gift settling over him like a warm blanket. He thought back to the countless nights he had spent wondering if he was enough, if he could truly give these girls the life they deserved. But now, standing before him, they had shown him that he had given them something far more valuable than he could have ever imagined. He had given them roots, a sense of purpose, a love that was boundless. As the evening drew on, they'd moved from the church to the grove itself, walking quietly among the towering trees, the moonlight filtering down through the branches. The air was cool and filled with the scent of pine, and Henry felt as if he were standing in the very heart of all he held dear. The girls gathered around him, laughing, sharing stories, their voices blending with the rustling leaves. It was a moment of pure peace, a moment that seemed to stretch on forever, suspended in time. And as they stood there, surrounded by the very land they had fought so hard to protect, Henry felt a sense of completion, of fulfillment. He had given his life to a cause he hadn't even fully understood when he first took them in, and yet, in doing so, he had found his true purpose. He realized that he had not only saved them, but had been saved by them, lifted up by their love and courage, their resilience and grace. When they finally returned home that night, each daughter hugged him tightly, whispering words of gratitude, promises to carry forward his legacy. As he watched them leave, one by one, Henry felt a warmth settle in his heart, a quiet certainty that he had lived a life of meaning, a life that had touched others in ways he could only begin to comprehend. The next morning, as he sat by the window, watching the sun rise over the grove, Henry closed his eyes and offered a silent prayer of thanks. His journey had not been an easy one, but it had been rich, filled with moments of grace and beauty, sorrow and joy. And as he looked out over the land that would remain untouched, preserved by the love of his daughters, he knew that his story, their story, would live on, not just in the grove or the town, but in each life they touched, in every heart they inspired. In that moment, he understood that family was not defined by blood or circumstance, but by the love they chose to give, by the courage to stand together in the face of adversity. It was a love that was boundless, eternal, and he knew that as long as the grove stood, so would the memory of their journey, a testament to all they had overcome and the legacy they had built together. And as the years passed, the grove became a place of quiet pilgrimage, a living memorial to Henry's unwavering faith and the family he had built against all odds. People came from all over to sit beneath those ancient trees, to feel the presence of something larger than themselves, a sense of hope that only love could bring. And in the whispers of the leaves, in the stories passed down from one generation to the next, Henry's legacy lived on, an unbreakable bond that time could never erode.